To put it bluntly, I would tell your listeners customer satisfaction is a one-way ticket to the business graveyard. How do you increase future cash flows? You do it in two ways: raise revenues, reduce or control expenses, and juice profitability as a result. And let's remember, shareholder value is driven by an increase in income, in projected future cash flows. The other example too that I would give you from the expense side of the equation is when you think about the employee experience component of a good customer experience. So executives are willing to take a leap of faith in many places, but not on customer experience. And in my view, that always reflected what I thought was a deep-seated skepticism about the value of a differentiated customer experience.
My name is Jochem van Veer. I'm the CEO and co-founder of a company called TheyDo, the journey management platform for business decision-making. We raised over $50 million and are growing globally. Our enterprise customers include Ford, J&J, the Home Depot, and Pfizer. I mean, wherever you look, understanding customers is key to staying ahead. But in order to do this at scale, aligning so many different teams with the customer journey is incredibly hard, but it is possible. I really wish this podcast existed before we started our company, because so many companies are organizing around journeys and there's so much to learn. So in order to share what I'm learning, what I'm hearing with our community, I meet with industry experts. And in my video podcast, I'm here to explore the world of business strategy, design, and journeys, customer journeys, to really get an understanding of how leaders are changing their way in their business. So let's dive into the show. So my guest today is Jon Picoult. He is the author of the best-selling book, From Impressed to Obsessed, 12 Principles for Turning Customers and Employees into Lifelong Fans. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend to pick it up. He's a customer experience and leadership expert, and he's been featured by dozens of media outlets, including the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, NBC News, Fortune, and Forbes. Today, he's running almost 16 years, Watermark Consulting, and advised C-suite executives for some of the world's most foremost brands. He's helping companies basically to capitalize on the power of loyalty, both in the marketplace and in the workplace. And what I love is the framework he developed for creating exceptional experiences. In his book, he emphasizes the importance of shaping not just experiences, but the memories they are based off on, associated with them. So, talking about having an edge on experience, Jon, welcome to the pod. I'm very excited to have you here.
Hey, Jochem, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
So you are writing in your book about satisfaction is mediocrity, all right? And a lot of people are doubling down on customer satisfaction. They are having a whole score-based organization around that. So they are not used to hearing that it's mediocrity. So why don't we start there and unpack that a little bit? Like, how are you thinking satisfaction is actually mediocrity?
Yes. So, to put it bluntly, I would tell your listeners customer satisfaction is a one-way ticket to the business graveyard. And the reason I say that is because study after study has shown that satisfied customers defect all the time. They just leave. So if you're trying to derive competitive advantage from the customer experience you deliver, it is not enough to merely satisfy your customers. You need to impress them. You need to leave an indelible impression in their minds that is going to cultivate the repurchase and referral behavior that's really the lifeblood of any thriving business. And so that's why I say, satisfaction is the wrong goal. You're aiming to satisfy, you're aiming for mediocrity. You've got to focus on impressions and going to, what you just referenced a moment ago about the whole memory science behind this. I use that term impression very deliberately because this is about creating indelible memories.
So how are you thinking about this playing out in real life, right? You have your Amazon where satisfaction is all about, like, was it a cheap and well-delivered package to my home? Did I get it in time or fast? That's a baseline expectation, right? But if we look at, let's say, a phenomenal experience that I had in this hotel in some wonderful place somewhere at the end of the world, that lasts or creates a different impression on me. Like, satisfaction means so many different things to so many different companies. Like, if we take retail banking or pick your poison, how should we think about it? Is that like satisfaction is this one thing that cuts across experiences for all these different brands, or is there more nuance to it in your mind?
Well, I think that what it takes to impress a customer I think does vary depending on the industry that you're in, the nature of the business, what people typically expect from that industry. But I guess here's what I would emphasize. I think it's very easy when people hear, "Oh, John's telling us to impress our customers." Well, that's going to be expensive. That means that, we need to create some sort of white glove Ritz-Carlton experience that's going to leave them wowed. What I would emphasize for people is that given how low the bar is set in customer experience across really most every industry, that oftentimes just nailing the basics, the fundamentals consistently very well can actually be surprising to folks and can actually be impressive. And, I'll give you an example that I'm sure you and your listeners have probably run across this as consumers yourselves, right? You call a business provider. Let's say it's your credit card company or your bank or maybe your health insurer, and maybe you've got a complex question for them. And the rep says, I need to research this. I'll get back to you. I'll give you a call back in a few days. What is everybody thinking in their head when they hear that from the rep? What you're thinking is, yeah, right. I'm never going to hear back from you, and I'm just going to have to call you and go through some morass of an 800-line greeting menu to try to find a live person. But now rewind for a moment, and let's say that rep says, well, Mr. Picoult, I need to research this. I'm going to get back to you Thursday by 5 p.m. And Thursday by 5 p.m., I actually get a call or an email from that rep. That, given what I was anticipating, I would argue that actually is an impressive experience. Yet what did they do? They just honored their promise. They honored the commitment that they made. But it's so rare that people do that in business today that I would tell you even that can leave an indelible impression on someone.
Right. I'm even scared sometimes when they say, like, I'm going to put you through with someone else. I'm like, okay, what is your name? Can you have a reference number for me so that I don't lose my case?
And
That's
then
right.
In case, and I always say to them, well, are you going to stay on the line, until I get to the person you're transferring me to, just so we make sure that I don't get dropped? But of course they won't do that. But yeah, these simple things that you might look at and say, those are table stakes. The fact is, so many companies don't deliver on those table stakes that when you do consistently, people notice.
Right. And also because the teams are looking for the big win, right? The thing that ends up in the news. Oh, they did this fantastic thing on the customer experience and we were responsible for that. Well, meeting baseline expectations is then like skipped over. Isn't it also so here's the other side of the equation. If we would only focus on baseline expectations, what we're doing is what is just enough, right? Is just enough to get that in place, or maybe it is just enough. But when we think about what is actually necessary in that context, how do you think about what is meeting baseline expectations, or actually like when meeting baseline expectations is over the threshold of like truly satisfying customers? Like, how should we think about that? Do you have a framework or a way of thinking about that, how people should adopt this when they want to do meeting the baseline expectation, but they also want to go beyond that?
Yeah, and what I would say is it's not an either or. I think that any robust customer experience strategy will have a sampling of tactics that are designed to both ensure that the fundamentals are nailed consistently, but also to start wading into what I'll call the nice to haves or the delights to have. What you just want to be careful about is you don't want to jump to the delight to have category until you have really strong confidence that we're nailing the fundamentals consistently and doing that well. Because a lot of people get attracted to, the shiny objects. It's like, these days we're going to deploy some AI-based solution and we're going to wow people. And that's all well and good, and you might deliver that out in the marketplace. But if you're failing on the fundamentals, I would argue it really doesn't matter. And so I think that's what you sort of have to keep your finger on the pulse on, is staying close to your customer to understand what are their common frustrations, not just with you, but with your industry as a whole. And that's when I think you can start to develop a sense of, well, how high or low is the customer experience bar for us and for our industry, so that we know what does it really take to exceed people's expectations, and to create that impression that goes beyond just delivering on the core fundamentals. So I don't think there's sort of a one-size-fits-all answer to that question. I think that every CX strategy should be approached from the perspective of, you want to make sure you don't just focus on the shiny objects at the expense of the fundamentals. And even while you are focusing on the fundamentals, you want to make sure that you're also investing some time and energy in starting to develop some of those distinctive, surprising elements that also help to form memorable impressions on people.
So how do I know we're ready? We're like, the fundamentals are good enough so we can move on to a delightful experience. Like, Is there a way to test?
Well, again, I want to say, if you're doing the fundamentals consistently in many industries, that might be delightful,
right? Exactly.
But I think, how do you know? I think it's by observing your customers and speaking with them. Looking, for example, at their digital body language. So how often is it that people have to contact you twice for the same need? Whether it's I'm going to your website, or maybe I'm switching channels, going from a website to text or to phone service. If you monitor people's behaviors, you have the opportunity to reveal friction points that they might not even take the time to tell you about. And so I think that's an important part of any CX program and CX improvement strategy, is sort of creating those listening posts. And by listening posts, mind you, I'm not just talking about surveys. I'm talking about listening posts where, you've got your ear to the ground, looking at the physical and the digital body language that people are using and the footprints that they're leaving, to get a sense of, hey, are there still a lot of common frustrations and annoyances that we really haven't addressed, but we need to direct attention to before we get more cute and clever? I think that's how you approach it.
Yeah. So, and in your example where you said, like, hey, look, if the rep actually not only says I'm going to call you back, but then gives you specific time by when he or she will call you back and give you a verdict on whatever the task was, that is like a very good example of a tiny change in the way, for instance, you approach this, that might be considered like a very decent improvement. So how do I know my baseline is in place? Because what we could argue is like, we have a contact center, all the calls are handled, people are not calling for the same thing twice. But you could at the same time argue like, but the way we handle it is not on par with, let's say, our principles or the way we do this. And this is often not in place. It's like, contact center, check. People call, check, we can help them. But this is a very refined example of like meeting that baseline satisfaction and actually like exceeding it. So what are some of the ways that we can look at our own business and think, hey, are we actually doing the basics really well and therewith exceeding expectations? Do you have examples of how we should think about finding those?
Yeah, well, one thing I would say is it's always helpful to step into the shoes of your customer. And I don't think that business leaders do this often enough, because their days are consumed with, fighting fires or whatnot. But, when was the last time that your board of directors actually called your 800-line service center? When was the last time your C-suite actually went through the process of setting up a new account with your business? I think those are very helpful exercises for people for two reasons. First, it helps to reveal where there might be places that you're not meeting basic expectations, or where you could do something different that really helps, leave an impression and raise the bar. But so there's a data collection component to that exercise that is valuable. But here's the other thing that I think is valuable about that. It appeals to the emotional side of business leaders. Because if you're a C-suite executive, or if you're a member of the board of directors, and you actually step into the customer's shoes. You try to execute a transaction online. You try to set up an account. You call the customer service folks. If it doesn't go well, if you start to see all of this ugliness that is accompanying the experience, it can be very motivating and very focusing for that executive team. Because, if you're a member of the C-suite or the board, I mean, you could read research reports ad infinitum about, the quality of your customer experience. It doesn't quite land as powerfully as when you experience it yourself or you observe someone else going through it. And, no executive likes to be part of a company that is exploiting customers and frustrating customers as opposed to delighting them and enriching them. And so I think the exercise of stepping into your customer's shoes can be not only helpful in terms of revealing actionable information on how to improve, but it can really coalesce an executive team around the idea that, oh my gosh, you know what? We've got to do something about this. Like, this is not acceptable. Let's kind of rally around this and make something happen. So that would be one example that I would toss out to you, is the idea of actually becoming a customer. I don't think enough business leaders do that regularly.
I love that example. Such a simple but often overlooked way of doing it. Like, when you work with executive teams, is this part of the curriculum? Like when Jon comes in, like, this is what
actually,
we do?
Just recently, I did a customer experience workshop for the top executives of a company, and before the workshop, I do a little digging, to just kind of get a sense of where is the ugliness in the experience. And so, one thing that I noticed that I brought up at this workshop that I conveyed to these folks is when you called their customer service, their technical support, it was the strangest thing was the numbering of the options. It didn't go sequentially. It wasn't like option 1, option 2, option 3. It was like option 2, option 4, option 7. And I was like, wow, that's weird. What happens if you press 1? There must be something when you press 1, like gives you a chance to dial an extension. And I would press 1 and nothing would happen. And as a matter, so I gave this example to them, and it was much worse than that. Like, actually, the way they were labeling the options was confusing to people, and resulted in a lot of misdirected calls, which was creating great strain on the organization, as making it less productive, and then also impairing the customer experience. So, I presented this to them as part in this workshop, and sure enough, like during the break, they're like all dialing, their their service number and listening to it. They're like, he's right, and they had no idea. They had no idea, because it's just not something that people think to do when you're at an executive level. Your time just gets taken up with other things, and you don't, it's a special kind of executive who reserves time every week or every month to step into their customer's shoes, or maybe to shadow their team who are serving customers on a day-to-day basis, be it in sales or service or another area. That takes a special kind of executive to do that. Not everyone does that, but it's time well spent.
So when you have this group of executives and they go through this, right? You can take this example or another one that comes to mind, but when you take them through this, I imagine instantly they want to have a bias to action, right? They're like, okay, exactly. We're ready. We want to do it, but it starts to wane out. But what they typically can't do is then change the experience. They have their directors and the managers and the teams underneath them. So they have to influence the organization. Of course, they can change the priorities and reset the strategy, but I imagine it's much more nuanced than that. So how do we go about that? Like, how do executives then start to take this new insight that they had on, even our baseline is out of whack, and we need to start bringing our teams along with that? Like, what are the best doing versus the mediocre ones, to use the term again?
Yeah. So, one thing I would say that the best ones do is they're really good at socializing the reality. Meaning, okay, I played, I recounted what this 800 line sounds like. They could just record it and they could use that at an all employee meeting and say, hey, here is a perfect example of a wart that we have that we're going to fix. But these are the things that we need for all of you to be on the lookout for and to tell us about, so that we know these annoyances and frustrations and peculiarities exist, and we can get them on the list and start addressing them. So I think the idea of socializing that information in a smart way is important, because just like you said, in this workshop, you're absolutely right. Everybody was like, well, we're going to change this tomorrow. And they actually did. Like, these were the top executives. They had the ability to just make that happen. But not everything is like that. And so you do want to make sure that you're using those opportunities to socialize with the larger organization, so that they get a sense of what does wrong look like, but then also socialize what right looks like. So, for example, we talked about that technical support rep who says, Mr. Picoult, I got to research this. I'm going to get back to you by 5 p.m. on Thursday. Right? You could take a recording of that call. You could play it for people, and then also tell them, oh, by the way, after the fact, this rep did call by 5 p.m. on Thursday, and you could say, this is what right looks like. I think that one of the biggest pitfalls that I see companies have when they try to embark on CX transformations and improvement programs is that the top executive team might make declarative statements that, hey, we want you to impress our customers. We want you to, do a great job, wow folks, whether you're meeting them in person, whether it's on the phone or whatever. But that clarion call for customer experience excellence is not accompanied with specifics. And so what happens is people go back to their cubicles, people go back to their, retail store or their remote office. And what they don't have the answer to is, what exactly do you want me to do differently? What exactly do you want me to do differently, Mr. C-suite executive, that's going to bring this customer experience vision to life for the company? And as you just noted, a great example of a specific is never tell someone on the phone, I'm going to get back to you shortly. Always tell them, give them a specific date and time. Because that doesn't happen all the time. That's going to, the customer's going to be like, oh, that's interesting. I don't hear that often. And then, of course, honor that commitment. That's a great example of what right looks like. And I think giving that specificity to people is important in engineering change. So that is one example I'd give you. The other, going back to your original question, is, and this obviously falls squarely within your business with journey mapping and whatnot. I think that any type of instrument, and I don't want to suggest that journey mapping is the only approach, but any type of instrument that opens people's eyes across the customer lifecycle spectrum, upstream and downstream, from sales to service to warranty, anything that allows people to see how does the experience unfold today? I think that is very helpful, because it is just human nature and it is organizational nature that we approach things from very parochial viewpoints. I work in this department, and just as hard as I try, my life is consumed by this little narrow slice of the customer experience puzzle, and that's what I know. I'm not quite sure what happens upstream, what happens downstream. And that's problematic, because you really need to have full visibility into the upstream and downstream to know how to engineer a great end-to-end customer experience. And so any vehicles that you can use, whether it's journey mapping, whether it's a workshop, whether it's just socializing stories, these are all helpful instruments for opening people's eyes to the broader experience. Because oftentimes, the best way to improve my part of the experience means doing something differently upstream that I might not be directly responsible for. And if I don't connect those dots and have a chance to engage with my colleagues to make that happen, then, it's never going to transpire.
And I think it works both ways, right? Top down, it's wonderful if your executive team believes like customer centricity is the way forward and they've been exposed to what is bad experience in their company and I want to make a change. That's wonderful if that happens. Typically, it's the other way around, right? It's the customer experience teams, the experience design function, user research. wherever the real pain points are bubbling up, and then getting that across to the executive team to get buy-in, sponsorship, and like, okay, let's change for the big part. That's also the hard part. So I want to double click on journey since you mentioned it. So journey mapping used to be also seen as like, okay, wonderful. We understand how the customer is walking, or like we can walk through their shoes in this particular experience. But because it was used to be a research endeavor, it was like stickies on a wall or stickies on a whiteboard or hi-fi presentation, but it's just a one-off. Either we accept the facts and we look at it and it's great, but usually what happens is like crickets. Because, okay, we get it, but how does it move the needle for the business? And I'm seeing now that those two perspectives together, it's like, how are we using the customer's perspective to tie it back to what the executive team cares about, which is revenue or cost cutting or protecting reputation, whatever it is at this point in time, how these things should blend together. And I think that's where the rubber meets the road, and then you have magic or a baseline to even execute on that. But that is, I think, the hard part. So let's say we come from a journey perspective, we come bottom up to the executive team. Over and over again, I've seen it is created, but then not accepted. And then it's looked at and it's like, okay, thank you, and nothing changes. So what have you seen that actually is working for teams that are approaching it in that way?
Yeah, so I think that what I have seen work is when I'm going to go back and to this idea of socializing stories. You know, it's one thing to put a journey map up and kind of walk people through it and whatnot. It's another thing to actually put in front of that executive team a physical document that is part of the experience that they may have not seen ever or recently. It could be a contract, a sales proposal. It could be a billing statement. I think where the rubber meets the road is when people see the artifacts that are associated with the experience. You know, not the diagramming of it, but let me hear the call. Let me see the video of what it looks like to wayfind within our stores. Let me see that billing statement that creates so much confusion with our customers. I think that those artifacts, in my experience, are the ones that garner the attention of people to a much stronger degree than just sort of looking at a depiction of a sort of an antiseptic academic depiction of a journey map on, you know, a wall and like a corporate piece of art. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, I love that. And that's also, it is what I'm seeing. Like even like I'm a UX researcher, like that's where I started my career, and we would do shadowing, right? We would just
exactly
hop on, I don't know, the delivery truck and drive together with the lunch delivery, working for a big retail organization. And we would look at how people would get their groceries in and what they were saying and what they were doing. And by actually observing that, we brought that back to the team, backing that up with like the bigger the metrics and the data that we collected from the data analytics team. And then we had a great story. And then people are moving the needle. But sometimes that's hard to do. And we focus on like, okay, journey map is a very technical drawing. And I've spent a ton of work in this, but no one understands what we actually did. And then it's back to business.
Yeah. I also think it's important for organizations to understand that the journey map is not the end. Like the journey map is the very beginning.
Right.
You know, it might take a lot to create a journey map. You might need to invest a lot of time and effort in it. But when you're done, like, you're not done. Like, you're just starting. And the reason I say that is because journey mapping is a very useful tool. Like anything else, it has its strengths and its weaknesses. You know, one potential weakness in journey mapping, and this is why I think it's important to understand it as a starting point, is that just sort of by design, a journey map can capture just so much level of detail about the experience. And I've had situations where I've worked with clients where once we dug in to particular customer episodes at a level of granularity that would not normally be done through a typical journey mapping exercise, what we would discover is there could be like a single sentence in a piece of correspondence that a customer gets that is actually sowing the seeds for later disappointment and confusion. And that's why I think it's so important to understand that journey mapping is an initial step. It must be followed with a more granular dive into the depths, the weeds of the experience, because sometimes the opportunities and the issues are lurking in the smallest details.
I love that. And you should see our quote. We had like 2 years on the website. It was like, mapping was never the end game, right? It's actually like journeys are more like a data model. They're like a continuous dynamic system of gauging what the experience is like and where are those like little nuggets in the experience are actually like predictors of like future churn or revenue gains. So I'm with you there, but I want to switch gears a little bit to talk about memorable experiences and actually like talk about cognitive biases a little bit, because your work, a lot of it also is around, let's say, the peak end rule, right? And it's like a common way of thinking about how a journey should be, how an experience should be. But I want to dig into the memorable piece of that. So we think about experience as if this is something that we can control, right? But the experience sits with the customer, and you're describing it to create these memories, lasting memories. So why don't we go there for a little bit? And why is that a different way to think about experience than what is commonly accepted in typical experience design or customer experience teams?
Yeah. So, I guess I'd start by saying what I think great companies recognize is that they're not just in the business of shaping people's experiences, they're in the business of shaping their memories. And I would argue that how people remember their experience with your business is even more important than the experience itself. And the way our brains are wired, those two things can actually be quite different. What we're feeling while we're going through the experience versus how we reflect on it afterwards. And as you know, this is all about the peak end rule. And it is the notion that most of our customer experience is forgettable. And that's just the way. That's not a statement on your company, right? It's just a statement on just the sort of the brain science around how we remember things. We don't remember our experiences. It's not like we remember every frame in the experience, and then there's some algorithm in our head that looks at the proportion of frames that were positive versus the ones that were unpleasant and calculates whether or not we're happy. That's not how it works. Rather than remembering every frame, we remember the peaks in the experience, we remember the values in the experience, and we remember the last thing that happens to us. And so the reason this has a bearing on how you go about engineering great customer experiences is you can sculpt people's memories. You can shape their perceptions, and you can sequence interactions in a way that helps to ensure they are going to remember the best parts of the experience, while the worst parts or the mediocre parts evaporate from their memory. And so if you apply memory science to customer experience design, what it essentially allows you to do is to take an imperfect customer experience and to make it memorable in a positive way, to make it brand building. And so I think that it's an area of great interest to me, obviously, as you saw, since the whole theme permeated my book. But the reason I find it fascinating is because it has such important consequences for how you go about designing a great customer experience. For example, just the idea, you talk about psychological biases. So this notion of the recency bias that we have, which means the last thing that happens to us in an interaction exerts a disproportionate influence over our perceptions and memory of that interaction. And so one of the principles that I talk about in the book is finishing strong, and the importance of making sure that the last touch point that you've got in an episode with your customer, you want to make sure that you end on a high point, because by doing that, you can actually eclipse the negativity, any negativity that might have developed by failing that customer in any way earlier in the encounter. And so that's, I think, the power of leveraging memory science for great customer experiences is it allows you to do those types of things. And I don't want to, I mean, this is going to sound like wrong, but it's really a way of manipulating people's memories, shaping their memories in a way that is conducive to them walking away with a positive impression of the encounter.
If you're enjoying this conversation, don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast channel and leave a review. It makes all the difference. The Experience Edge podcast is where I interview business leaders, CX pioneers, and the best designers who share their insight on creating business impact, having an edge on the customer experience. Do you want more exclusive content and behind-the-scenes access? Check out the Experience Edge podcast on YouTube and LinkedIn so you don't miss a thing. Now let's get back to the conversation. All right. One thing I find fascinating is like you use the word episodes, right? So you have the end-to-end experience and you break them down by episodes. Like for folks not familiar with that terminology, that might be more familiar with like micro journeys, macro journeys, experiences, and how those are all connected. Like, can you walk me through like how you think about episodes? And because why I think it's important is that you can't do a peak end experience for everything, right? If I'm a bank and if I have my KYC journey where I have to like identify myself with my passport and scan that, right? That's just a tiny, tiny part of the experience. But there's probably a whole team dedicated to that particular quote unquote experience. So when we think about episodes, like how is the language or how is the structure in your head? Where does an episode begin and end?
Right. So, great question, and I had to answer that question when I was writing the book too, because I didn't know the answer offhand. And so when I researched it, what I discovered, because there's actually been research into this, is from the customer's perspective, what they view as an episode in the whole end-to-end experience is any time when they feel that they have accomplished something. So if your customer feels like they've accomplished something, even if it is just a small part of their overall life cycle with your firm, that is an episode. And I like to use that term and define sort of, that beginning and end, because you can apply the memory science to that episode. And, to give you an example here, so people will say with that finishing strong principle, people immediately think, oh, well, there's only one place where we can do that, right? It's at the end of the whole experience. It's like, when at the conclusion of my entire relationship with that business that I'm patronizing. And that's actually not the case, because you can apply that principle to each episode and you can attempt to finish strong within each episode. And what that does is it means that my memory of that episode and the degree to which it influences the valence of my brand perception, positively or negatively, you have an opportunity to influence that by finishing strong at each endpoint within those episodes. And I'll give you an example from like the banking world, because you mentioned that before. Let's say if I go into a retail bank and I have an interaction with a bank teller, and I'm doing something with them, that I'm going to call that an episode because I'm going to accomplish something there. Okay. If at the end of that interaction, if the bank teller, pauses, looks me in the eye and says, okay, Mr. Picoult, let me just recap what we've done today and what are the next steps that I'm going to need from you or that you're going to see from us when we're going to be in touch with you next. That is actually a way to end on a high note as compared to, in many interactions, you could conceive, that teller contact might just sort of like end on a neutral note, like, okay, thanks for coming in, see you. And I might feel some ambiguity about, well, wait, when am I going to hear a confirmation about this transaction that I just executed? So my point is, that's a way of finishing strong just within that tiny episode. And it's a way to make me feel better about that encounter, which is inevitably going to help elevate my impression of that relationship I have with the bank in totality.
So it sounds like, and I just want to double click on it because there's a nuance to it. It sounds like the episode is about the feeling a customer has that she completed something.
Yes.
Right? It doesn't have to be true from the retail bank's perspective. It's like you're still in the process, right, of getting this account open or a loan or whatever it is that you're doing. You feel that you've accomplished something.
Yes.
That's the moment.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. I like that a lot.
And I think it behooves anybody in CX design to look at those encounters at the episode level, because there is a beginning and there is an end. And as such, you can apply memory science to create peaks and avoid valleys and finish strong within those distinct episodes.
Yeah. What are some of the other principles of psychology or biases that are often overlooked when designing these experiences? Like pecan is one, recency bias is another, you mentioned it. What are some of the others that you find very useful when designing an experience?
Yeah, so there's one that I would highlight, and of the 12 principles described in the book, this is one that I really love because it's very impactful, and yet it can be employed often at zero cost. And it's known as giving your customer the perception of control. And let me explain the psychology behind this. We as human beings, we like to be in control of our surroundings. We like to have what's known as direct behavioral control, our hands on the steering wheel driving. But the problem is, in many businesses, you can't give your customer direct behavioral control. If you need medical attention, you can't perform surgery on yourself. You need to delegate that to another party. If you're looking to buy a life insurance policy, you can't underwrite it yourself. You have to delegate that to a third party. And my point is that given the psychology here, the moment your customer delegates any part of the experience to you or a third party, they will immediately feel less good about the entire encounter. That's just the pure science around it. But the silver lining here is that there's been a lot of research into this, and what's been found is that there's a very good proxy for giving people direct behavioral control, and that is giving them the perception, the sense that they have control. And if you do that, people will actually feel better about the experience that you are delivering to them, even if you don't lift a finger to improve the underlying mechanics of the experience. And let me give you an example of what I mean here. A very well-researched example is simply the idea that a known weight always feels better than an unknown weight. If you step into line and somebody tells you the approximate wait from where you're standing is 5 minutes, that is going to feel like a much better experience to you than if you stepped in the line and nobody said anything to you. Nobody set any expectation. This is why at theme parks like Disney World, for example, prominently displayed at the entrance to every attraction, what do you see? It's the real-time updated wait so that you immediately have that expectation. And merely by setting expectations, what that does is it gives you a sense of control, because you now sort of know, what's coming on the horizon, what's around the corner, whether it is a 5-minute potential wait or the next step in the process, whatever it is. And that makes you feel better about the whole encounter, even if the wait isn't getting any shorter. And so this is a very valuable tool to use for any organization, any business that has complex, elongated, multi-step processes. What you should be asking yourself to capitalize on the psychology here is, are we giving our customer the perception of control? And one way to do that is by setting expectations clearly, letting them know, hey, here are the steps in the process. Here's where you are. Here's what comes next and when. Another way to give people the perception of control is to give them agency, to allow them to exercise choice in the experience. So think of a customer service unit. If you just give me one way to contact you, the only way I can contact you is by email. Customers might not love that, because it doesn't give them any sense of control. It's sort of like they're railroaded into just one avenue for contacting you. But if you give them a choice, hey, you can contact us by phone, by text, by email, by chat, that's a better experience, because people now feel like they have agency. And when I have agency, I feel like I'm in control of what's going on, and I'll immediately feel better about the whole encounter. So that is an example of one of these biases and one of these psychology precepts that I just love because it's so easy to implement and it really costs nothing, yet it can have such a tremendous impact on the impression that's left on people.
So if I'm in CX and listening to this, so we're going to break down the experience in episodes, right? Where people really feel they've accomplished something. We're going to draw from psychology and we're going to use the pecan rule to really make it memorable for them. And we're going to make sure we're meeting the baseline expectations on at least all of them. Great. But then the business comes in and says, okay, well, what's in it for us? Like, this takes long. This is a big endeavor for us as a company to do. So I want to, for the last bit of the conversation, hone in a little bit on like how to quantify the impact, how to bring the return on investment into doing this work, and actually like not promising the big end goal after 3-5 years of like doing the hard work, but like chipping away at the future step by step. So how do you help executive teams or maybe even like experienced teams bridge the gap between, okay, fine, we will invest in this, but we're going to get results the next quarter as well as in the next 5 years? So what is your take on bringing the financial impacts back to the business doing this work?
Yeah. So the first thing is you need to speak in the language of the people you're trying to influence. And in the case of a board of directors or in the case of the C-suite executives, that's not the CSAT score. That's not the NPS score, typically. It's financial measures. If you're a public company, it's shareholder value. This was something I grappled with when I started Watermark Consulting 16 years ago. And I grappled with it even in my corporate roles before launching my own company. Because here's the ugly truth. A lot of executives out there are more than willing to take a leap of faith on a whole host of decisions, right? You think about mega billion or mega million acquisitions and mergers. There's no way that somebody with confidence can show, oh, you're absolutely going to get an ROI from this. There's a leap of faith that you take. Or when companies hire multi-million-dollar celebrity CEOs. Think about Brian Niccol. No offense to Brian Niccol, just recently hired as Starbucks' new CEO. He had, last year, his pay package was worth over $100 million. Are you telling me that somebody calculated, like sharpened the pencil and calculated what the ROI was going to be on that pay package? Absolutely not. So executives are willing to take a leap of faith in many places, but not on customer experience. And in my view, that always reflected what I thought was a deep-seated skepticism about the value of a differentiated customer experience. And so one of the first things I did when I started Watermark was to actually do research to try to prove that ROI. And it's actually, maybe we can put it in the show notes, or your listeners can Google it. But the Watermark Consulting Customer Experience ROI study, which was the first study, as far as I can tell, that actually showed a connection between customer experience quality and shareholder value. And we update it every few years. It's now got 16 years of data, and it shows very vividly that companies that excel in customer experience outperform those that lag in customer experience by an over 5-to-1 ratio in shareholder return. And even if you are a private company, I would argue this is relevant, because even a private company is seeking to maximize its value, its market value, even if it's privately owned. And so what this data really illustrates is that there is an ROI to customer experience if you look at it at the macroeconomic level. And so that is one thing I would say, because I have found that study to be very helpful in terms you put that, there's one chart, you just put it in front of executives, and it at least is a conversation starter, because it is hard to ignore the data from that study. Now, I'm not suggesting that you just put that bar graph in front of the execs and they're going to write you a blank check. I think then CX teams need to go from the macro argument to the micro argument. And the micro argument involves specific potential improvements and identifying how is that either going to drive revenue or how is it going to reduce expenses? And that is a really important or, because one of the things that I think where CX teams get tripped up is when they're trying to make the case for CX based on revenue improvements, because it's really tough to do that with certainty. And so that's often where they get sort of thrown out of the corner office. But there are a whole host of ways that CX improvements help to reduce expenses. We were just talking about the perception of control. If you give your customers really good perception of control about where they are in an complex, elongated process, do you know what that means? They're going to call less frequently asking you, what's going on? What's the status? If you shave, say, 5 or 10% of your call or contact volumes out just because you're giving people better perception of control, there's an ROI there. And it's a hard dollar, and it's really relatively easy to prove. So that's what I mean about looking at the micro piece and really emphasizing the expense portion. Not saying that you forget about the revenue part, but it's just the fact of the matter is executives respond more willingly to the expense part of the equation because it usually can be quantified more easily. Let me pause there, give you a chance to react or ask questions.
No, I'm seeing exactly the same, right? Like getting the expense part down is giving often like a customer experience team permission to tackle bigger problems, right? It's like, oh, you proved that you can actually have a financial impact on the business. Okay, why don't you do it again? Oh, by the way, here we have a potential impact on revenue growth, on acquisition, whatever it is. Would you allow us to also go for that? And then people are much more receptive to it versus like, we're going to start with the big picture and we're going to drive revenue for the business. Like, there are so many functions driving revenue. Like, go back to your customer experience function, please. So I think like that piece is giving permission to set you up for it. But ultimately, it should be about maximizing revenue because happy customers, happy business, happy shareholders, right? That's the equation. That's pretty simple, I think.
Right. And let's remember, shareholder value is driven by increase in income, in projected future cash flows. How do you increase future cash flows? You do it in two ways: raise revenues, reduce or control expenses, and juice profitability as a result. And so, yeah, I think that both levers, the revenue side, the expense side, need to be tended to by CX teams.
Do you believe that ultimately, like every episode should have a business case behind it, or could have a business case behind it that ties both to revenue or let me say not both, but like tied to revenue or tied to cutting expenses? Does every episode need to have that?
I'm going to say no, because I don't think it's realistic. I think that there simply are some episodes or some interactions or some experiential elements that you simply will never be able to prove an ROI for. And you know what? I'm at peace with that. And I think that every CX professional should be at peace with that. I'm not saying that you can't prove any ROI from anything, but to suggest that everything a business does, customer experience or otherwise, is going to have a quantifiable ROI, I don't think that's realistic. And I think this gets to making that macro argument case to the executive suite, because you got to get people in a mindset where they're willing to, give you a little rope. They're willing to take at least a little bit of a leap of faith because they believe in their heart that if we enrich the lives of our customers, it's going to come back and pay off in spades. I think that if you don't get the executive team in that place, it's going to be a really tough road to hoe going forward.
So starting in the contact center to figure out like what are people calling for, low value calls that we could actually solve somewhere else in the experience is a great place to start to cut expenses, because you just get less calls, saving you millions a year. What are other places for people listening that want to start and build their first business case that you typically advise customer experience teams to really start address the financial impact that they can have with the work they do?
Yeah, well, let's not forget that even in the sales process, there are contacts. You mentioned the customer service piece and the opportunity to reduce the number of contacts. Well, in sales experiences, unless it is just like very transactional, I'm at a supermarket and I'm just at the I'm just like cashing out whatever I bought. In many businesses, within a sales process, there is an opportunity to reduce the number of back and forth interactions that have to occur for your customer to have all the information they feel they need in order to make an informed decision, and for them to actually go about and effortlessly make the purchase transaction. So I would encourage teams not just to focus on the idea of how do we reduce contacts post-sale. There's an opportunity, even pre-sale and during the sales process, where you could say to yourself, are our marketing materials clear? Is the sales information that we're giving to prospects, does it clearly outline our value proposition and all of the great elements of our service? Does it proactively answer the most common questions that people have? Because if the answer is no, it's going to create inefficiency. It means that your salespeople are going to be fielding these follow-up questions from prospects, and it's going to take those salespeople away from developing more new business. So to me, that's the notion of preempting the need for people to contact you is something that applies whether I am a prospect or whether I'm a customer. The other example, too, that I would give you from the expense side of the equation is when you think about the employee experience component of a good customer experience. So here, it's what I'm referring to is what are the hurdles that your team has to, overcome? What hoops do they have to jump through in order to accomplish something for your customer? Because every company I've ever worked with, 99% of the people, they come to work every day. They want to do a great job for you and for your company. But there are things within the workplace, constructs, infrastructure, that thwarts their ability, hampers their best efforts. So if you are looking at ways to make it more effortless for your own employees to effectively deliver the experience to your customers, that is another way to not only deliver a better experience, but to do it at a more efficient cost.
I like that. And I'm also seeing that especially on the sales efficiency side, right? Because there is a lot of legacy systems in place, processes or policies that are outdated, that are preventing people from actually delivering a great experience because we've done it always like this, right? Or this is just how it works, right? So removing those frictions is actually driving, therefore, revenue because it just increases the likelihood of a customer ability to buy. So the last thing to touch on maybe is that what I'm seeing and what my customers are seeing is that they want to invest in this, but sometimes they can use a little help. So they get consultancies like yours to really help find where and how to start. But it used to be a few big consultancies across the globe driving this. And now we have a lot of specialty boutiques that are really, really specialized in parts of this and are doing great work on this. So you've been in here for 16 years. So I want to shine a light on how CX teams, executive teams should think about picking a right partner to drive a transformation with or work through the financial impact on customer experience. How should we go about that?
My answer is probably going to be biased. Since I lead
figured,
a boutique
but
consultancy.
But look, maybe before you answer, one more perspective is that I'm also seeing that because AI is making us much more sharp, we can have access to way more data and do way more analysis with them for the customer. The landscape is changing quickly. So that is propelling a different type of interaction and a different expectation from what a customer experience team might need from an outside partner to help them drive this. So those are two of the things I see. I'm scratching my customer's itch here a little bit, but getting your biased perspective is super helpful here.
Yeah. So let me start with the biased piece. And that is, I don't know, I mean, this is going to sound offensive probably to any large consultancy, but when I was back in the corporate world, one thing that always bothered me when engaging with large, big four type consultancies is the senior partner would come and sell you on the engagement. But the moment you sign the dotted line, they disappear and the newly minted MBAs parachute on your front lawn and start training on your dime. And when I launched my own consultancy, I just always, promised myself that I was never going to follow that model. And so, I make sure that I'm personally involved in every client engagement that Watermark has. So, it's not to say that there aren't situations where hiring a big consultancy is preferable. I think that those circumstances exist, but I guess the advice that I would give to people is you want to make sure you understand who's going to be working on your project. That is a really important question to ask up front. Because you might be impressed with the senior partner that's sort of, engineering the deal, but you might not ever see that senior partner again. So that's a really important thing to ask. The second thing I would say is you really need to step back and ask yourself, what exactly is the problem that we're trying to solve? Are we really very focused on just the digital experience? Okay. And I want to be clear. You've got to look at the customer experience holistically. If you just focus on digital and you never get to other parts of it, you're going to fail. But you got to eat the elephant one bite at a time. I get that. And so, you might say to yourself, hey, digital experience is where we want to focus. That's going to steer you a certain way. It should steer you, in my opinion, in a certain way in terms of what type of consultancy you work with, because then it makes sense to maybe align yourself with one that actually is specializing, as you referred to, those specialists within a particular domain. But if you were to step back and say, hey, really our goal here is more to develop kind of a broad overarching CX strategy to know, how do we go forward and what is the approximate order of steps that we should take? That's a very different problem statement. And that might mean that you're not going with a specialist. You're going with more a strategic consultancy, which may lead to follow-on engagements with other suppliers. So those are the kinds of questions I think are important to ask. And then I would also add, I think there's one sort of, there's one thing that you should be on the lookout for. And that is consultancies that rebrand themselves based on the shiny object du jour. So throughout corporate history, you see this over and over again. There are technology companies, for example, that rebranded themselves as customer experience consultancies. They weren't really customer experience consultancies, though. What they were really doing was selling their technology, within the context of customer experience. You've got folks that are rebranding their entities as AI specialists today. Back in the day, it was, re-engineering was the rebranding that all the consultancies went through. So I think that you need to make sure when you're evaluating a consultancy to work with that you're taking anything they say with a grain of salt. And that you're looking really at their history. Have they changed their colors sort of chameleon-like over time just to align with the interest du jour in the market? Or have they been sticking to their knitting? And if so, what is that knitting? And does it align with what we want to accomplish in our organization? So I think that's another important thing to be on the lookout for because, and I have to apologize for the consulting industry on the whole here that this even happens, but it's just the fact that this is how consultants operate is I brand this way today, but then tomorrow when it's big data or when it's predictive analytics or when it's AI, I'm just going to rebrand, but I'm still offering the same stuff.
All right. So I think the point of asking who will be on my account with me is a very good one. And I'll also add one more thing is that it's very easy to get references, right? Just call some of the past customers and say, hey, what was the engagement like? Which is also a pretty good indicator for potential success.
That is an excellent point. Yeah.
Jon, if people want to find you specifically, and they don't want to have a big co coming in, but they want to have a specialized co coming in, we'll link to the report that you're doing, the research that you're doing on the ROI case for sure. But if they want to reach out to you or your firm, what is the best place that people can find you?
Sure. You can go to Watermark's website, which is watermarkconsult.net. And from there, you can get to all the free resources that we offer, as well as information about all of our services, ranging from consulting to workshops and keynote speeches and whatnot.
All right. We'll put notes in the show notes for that. Jon, thank you so much for sharing your perspective and being with me here today. It was phenomenal.
My pleasure. I enjoyed it.
All right, and that's it. Thank you so much for listening. If you found it valuable today, don't forget to subscribe to the Experience Edge on your favorite podcast channel, leave a review, and share it with your team. I'd be delighted. Today's episode was brought to you by Daydo, an AI journey management solution for enterprise. To have an edge on your business strategy and to know why your customers do what they do, visit daydo.com and explore more resources to accelerate your customer experience game. And remember, the journey to creating customer-centric impact never ends, and here's always a new edge to discover in doing things differently. Next week, new episode. Until then, keep pushing the edge, stay inspired. See you in the next episode.